pen to page 39, talking about accountability, which no doubt is one of everybody's favorite subjects. I've got a whole bunch of notes here, so it's just a matter of finding the right ones. Accountability. It is not, and I say this because I think a lot of times when we think about accountability, we kind of cringe and are unsure about the value, or unsure of kind of our level of participation in that. So a couple of things that accountability, at least from a biblical standpoint, is not. It's not coercive. I don't think it's something that's to be invasive. You know, it's not like we're spying on each other and looking, for somebody to fail or fall and have kind of a gotcha moment. Like that's not actually the point. Accountability is not some sort of legalism where we try to, shove things down people's throats. And so we'll actually talk about legalism a little later. We look at a passage of scripture for today. On the flip side, accountability finds its kind of foundation in relationship. Again, it's something I think even as Christians we're called to know each other, to be present in each other's lives to the extent where there is a sort of natural accountability, to the extent where you maybe have the freedom or the knowledge to ask certain questions, to push for certain things, and kind of that freedom or even that gravitas to speak into somebody's life. And so there's several Bible verses that get to this. I'm reading about Ephesians chapter 5, where it talks about how we are to submit to one another, and that's not everything that submit means, but I would suggest that it's a part of even submission. So just out of curiosity, how have you seen this? What is this, or what's your experience with accountability been like? Have you had experience with kind of a biblical accountability? Years ago, I had a friend who was just, he really had good issues going on in life, and he kind of, more off each other. So it's not easy to create. I guess it's kind of trusting in a relationship, but it was strengthening. You have a bad day, and you share, we have no trouble with each other, and never seems judgment, always here to here, and courage, and both ways, and it's strengthening.
And I think to that degree, it's very, I hate to say it, I think it's very hard to find.
Yeah.
We don't like to expose ourselves. We want to, I think I'll say it, I'm a much better Christian outside my home with other people than my wife. I mean, I get home, it's like, okay, I'm frustrated, I've done all day, and sometimes it takes out, I don't have cat kick out, so I can take out my wife again. But I mean, I think that's us, and it's good to have that person, that you can have that kind of honesty and be vulnerable with them. But it's a very rare thing. I think it's when you create, it's just something I think that formed, I think, over time, friendship and trust.
I agree with that. And that's one of the difficulties on some level, like I think you can work at it, but it strikes me that you can't force it or, make it happen. I mean, there's probably things that you can do that encourage it. Anybody else? I know that's a lot of silence. I'll just say that, I've been on some level, I've been on both sides of it. Again, it's not the most common thing ever. But there are some people in my life, or several people in my life that are close enough that know me well enough, that I trust and that I know will ask me questions like that. and I'll throw one of them under the bus just because I like them and I think most people do as well. Every time I talk to Mark Gold, I got a couple questions for you. And I know well enough, like I know where this is going, and that's a good thing. I know Mark well enough and trust Mark, that he genuinely desires good for him. So again, that's a positive thing. I've had people from this church, show up at my office. And, hey, I want to talk to you. Sure. What do you want to talk about? In front of me. And do it in I think a positive, productive way. So I've kind of been on both sides of that, and I'll just be honest with you guys. I've been in have some relationships where people have expected me to do that for them and actually got upset with me to do it. And so that's why it's kind of unpleasant to hear on someone, but that's actually a healthy mindset that we have that desire that again we want to be accountable. We want to have close enough relationships where people can ask us some questions, can push a little bit. Anyway, here's the point. So quickly then, on 39, I want to mostly skip ahead to the next page, but on 39, just from a biblical standpoint, understand that the Bible encourages confession. Psalm 51 is huge for that. James 5:16, and I think that's in the notes here, therefore confess your sins to each other and pray for each other that you may be healed. So the Bible suggests not only that we confess our sins to God, ultimately all sin is an offense against God, but there is a sense in which hey, it's not needed for forgiveness per se, but it's actually helpful to for sanctification if we confess our sins to each other and we're able to share and it eases the burden, to kind of bring somebody else into some of this trouble. The second point there on 39, Scripture warns us against self-deceit. It's amazing how blind I think that we can be sometimes to our own lives or to our own sin. And again, you see that in verse 3 verse. But encourage one another daily, what we call today, so that you encourage each other, so that none of you become hardened through sin deceit. And then the last thing there, you see that Scripture encourages honesty about weakness. But with that, flip to the next page, and we're going to hang out here for a couple moments. Guidelines for accountability in relationships. In terms of, okay, how do we do this well? And moving from the maybe theological to the more practical side. So let's just work through that list. Ask good questions. The reference there is Proverbs chapter 20. That passage. In Proverbs chapter 20, the purpose of the man's heart is like deep water, but a man of understanding will draw it out. The writer of the proverb is using kind of this picture of a well, and saying, look, a wise man is going to have a rope, or he's going to have a bucket and a rope long enough to get to that water to draw this out. I would suggest that when we think about accountability, that questions are always a good place to start. You may think you know exactly what's going on, but ask a question. Don't make assumptions. Don't make accusations. It's always better to begin with some kind of a question. Hey, I saw this, or I heard this. I noticed this attitude. I noticed this action in your life. Tell me are you okay? What's going on? Some of those are helpful. And questions that really, I think, push beyond just the surface. So, just thinking about this and reading about this a little bit today, but let's just hypothetically throw out and say that you struggle with anger. That's a thing in your life to the point where it's sinful. So, what kind of questions? You have a straw man here that's really, really angry all the time. What kind of questions might you be able to ask to kind of push or to probe about their anger? Put yourself in that situation. situation? What are these questions that maybe you ask to draw the deep water out? It's a great question. So when do you get angry? Like, is there a certain trigger? Is there a certain thing that always sets you off? I mean, it's actually really helpful to know. What else might you ask about who are angry friends? Okay, so you can kind of get to the beyond just the emotional, like it's rather practical on some level, or rather thinky on some level. It's not a word I know somewhere, but yeah, like okay, what are you really accomplishing? You know, what's the result of it? Like that. What else? Okay. Okay.
Sometimes they have to identify using the word. That you really want, reward, that would be just never gotten by it.
So yeah, when did this start? Was there something that triggered this? This was after this was after you lost your job, and all of a sudden you become really angry. Like I think you can rightly work towards something. Kind of on the mindset, what's the payoff? Like, what do you hope to achieve by this? What's the motive behind it? And I'll just be honest, I'm not great at these questions or asking these questions, but one of the things that people say about anger is that kind of habitual anger often rises out of some kind of insecurity. It's an attempt to manipulate or to control an environment. And that's the deep water when you think about something like anger. So, okay, what is the heart issue that is driving it? There's some kind of insecurity, there's some kind of desire. Like if that's what it is, well, that's the deep water. Like that's where this anger ultimately is coming from. Yeah, I mean the trigger is something surface level. But you know what I mean? Like sometimes it's questions, not just, hey, you're a really angry person, you gotta knock it off. It's maybe not really helpful to approach it. So ask good questions. Be a man or be a woman, be a person of he had grown up following all of these Jewish rules and regulations. So eat this, don't eat this. On Sabbath you can do this, but not this. As Seth alluded to, circumcision was a big thing in the Jewish community. So it was a big thing in the Jewish community. And so he would just had all of these rules. Well, when Jesus comes along and Peter meets Jesus, and so now Peter basically transfers from being a Jew to being a Christian, a Christ follower, somebody that follows Jesus. And one of the things that Jesus does, right, is he says, all of these rules and regulations, not that they're bad, but you don't have to follow all these things. Like there's actually great freedom in following Jesus. Jesus comes to fulfill the law. So anyway, you get to Acts chapter 10, and we don't have time to get into it, but there's this Roman centurion, this guy named Cornelius. And Cornelius has a vision and is instructed to reach out to Peter. Peter simultaneously has a vision of a sheep full of unclean animals coming down from heaven, and God telling him to eat. And Peter's like, but I can't eat these animals. Because in the Jewish religion, you couldn't, it's like a blanket full of bacon comes down from heaven. And God's like, you should eat this. And Peter's like, but I can't. It's bacon. It's from a pig. It's an unclean animal. And God's like, no, these things are clean, right? So anyway, long story short, Peter has this vision and comes to realize that as a Christian, there is freedom from some of these regulations. And he goes and interacts with Cornelius and all that. As Seth alluded to in Acts chapter 15, this is a huge deal in the early church. Church started out as Jewish people beginning to follow Christ. But they had this habit of saying, well, if you want to be a Christian, if you want to be a Christ follower like us, you have to kind of follow all of these rules, and circumcision is probably the biggest one. And so they were kind of legalistically making these rules and saying that you weren't a good Christian unless you did some of these things. And we kind of look at it and we're like, well, that's silly, like, whatever. But that was a huge issue in the early church. They have, as Seth said, they have this council, they have this huge meeting in Jerusalem, and all the apostles get together, and they decide that, no, you want to follow Jesus, you just have to follow Jesus. So you don't have to become a Jew first. You don't have to get circumcised or follow all of these dietary regulations. Like you can get up and you can eat bacon and still follow Jesus, and that's okay. Like that is really where they end up, and Peter's on board with it. So, with that as a little bit of context, let me read from Galatians 2. This is 4 verses or so to see again, and then we'll play our. But we'll get some of the staff's observation, interpretation, application, and push towards some personal response. So Galatians chapter 2. And I'm just going to change Cephas to Peter because that's how we usually know. But so Galatians 2. But when Peter came to Antioch, and this is Paul writing this, Paul, opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he, that's Peter, was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Peter before all of them, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force Gentiles to live like you? And I know we're kind of putting it off mid-theme, but that's more or less the narrative part of the story, and it's enough, I think, for us to chew on tonight. So that's the passage. Quickly, what, from an observation standpoint, what do you see? What's jumping out at you? Okay, so right away, I mean, that's what we've been talking about tonight, accountability. So right away, here is, and don't miss this, like we're talking about Paul and Peter, and they're not Jesus, But in the New Testament, like in the early church, in terms of the leaders of the early church, that's these guys. I mean, if in the Roman Catholic worldview, Peter is the first pope. All right, so this is the so think about that. You know, I don't know what the counterpart to the pope is, but this is somebody going to the pope and confronting them. All right, this is huge. These Peter, Paul, and James, these are the leaders of the early church. So right away, we have this picture from the Bible of this is what accountability, this is what godly accountability, confrontation looks like. So absolutely, right away, that's what's going on here. Paul's going to Peter and being like, dude, what in the world? What are you doing? Well, yeah. So we maybe just need to stick with the observation now, but there's some interpretation there, like, wow, if I'm acting like a hypocrite and I'm a leader.
Even before that, I kind of do this in observation, and the rest of the Jews acted whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Because it's a fact. Peter did this, and so did they.
Yeah. So they look at Peter and like, oh, sure, we're going to do that too. Absolutely. Yeah, we'll get to the interpretation. What else on the observation side? Yeah, absolutely. And we say, I agree with that. He's acting out of fear. Who's he afraid of? Okay, so and this is kind of working through the passage, and that's why I like to give you a scratch paper. I mean, so in verse 12, I went and I circled the certain men. You can see that at the beginning of verse 12. Certain men came from James. And then later on in verse 12, at the end of the verse, the circumcision party. It's talking about the same group of people. Like the certain men and the circumcision party, this is the same group. Okay? These are the legalists that are saying, wow, you want to be a Christian, you got to abide by all these Jewish regulations. So,
That's I was kind of thinking, well, I was confused. Is he still struggling with that internal battle of, still following his old rules? Or was he physically scared of those men and what they would do?
No, that's a great question, especially if we're just thinking about observation. Like that's a great, what is really going on in Peter's mind? I think that it's more that he's scared and he's going to kind of drift that way because the verse says, he feared these people. It's interesting if you go back and you read, let's say Acts 10. I think it's the beginning of Acts 11. Like this actually isn't the first time that Peter's been confronted about this. Like he was confronted. Beginning of Acts chapter 11. People go to him and they're like, dude, you're eating bacon. What's going on? And in that time, he stands up and he's like, no, this is what happened. It's okay. Peter, if you look at him, I think there's a lot of sanctification that happens in Peter, but even if you think about Jesus' crucifixion, like Peter's the guy that denies, oh Jesus, I'll never deny you. And 2 hours later, a couple hours later, he denies him 3 times. He's like, I never knew this guy. I never really met Jesus. So there's maybe some personality there where he's susceptible to being swayed by the opinions of others. There's a fear, and I would say that I think as he matures in his faith, that kind of lessens. Yeah, I think so. Now you can make the argument, of course, if he was really grounded in his faith and his understanding, then he would be swayed by fear. What else? Yeah. Yeah, no, but I think that's, I mean, that's a fair observation, and that's coming from, middle of verse 14, I said to Peter before all of it. Yeah. I mean, there's a thought, it's kind of like public sin, public confrontation, private sin, private sin. Clearly, because, as Bill pointed out, this was, what Peter was doing was public, because other people were following him, in doing it. So I do think there's some wisdom in that public private. What else do you see? What else? Any observations?
Those kind of you're saying that, but even Barnabas part, when he didn't know who Barnabas was, he just said that in his head. Like, that has to be reflected.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it seems like they need to figure out, like, why is it so hard? Yeah.
I think Paul makes a big deal, because Barnabas, I mean, this is one of his traveling companions. Barnabas went on like these missionary journeys, and he's been through it. I think Paul was putting in like, especially Barnabas, you of all people. But you think about, and so Seth had mentioned some of these things. The fact that Barnabas gets caught up in this, there is a sense of humility that all of us need. Like, none of us are actually above stupidity, or giving in to peer pressure. And we need to be humble enough to admit that. Yeah, I got caught up in this. It is. It just is. Well, okay. Mhm. Yeah, and you look at, again, at verse 14, you know, what Gentile how to do, and everything. So, yeah, there's a distinction, I mean, just between lifestyle, and again, this is, is what you eat and how you dress and what you do on this day or don't do on this day, and the whole thing, like there is lifestyle things, like daily routine lifestyle things that are different between how they do, or good to it. Seth mentioned something, I think it was the last point on that list that we were working through. When we think about accountability or confronting somebody, it needs to be grounded in the Bible. Like, what's the problem? 14. Yeah, Paul looks at Peter, and it's not, Peter, I don't think you're doing this right, or Peter, in my tradition, this isn't right. It's Peter, you're not living in step with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Like, it's not really what your personal opinion. Like that's a cult. A cult gets fixated on an individual, and they begin to follow this individual, and whatever this individual says and thinks and does. Like, that's how you get on the crazy train. But Paul is very much like, dude, you're missing the whole gospel. It's the whole point. I mean, easy observation stuff. We talked about this a while ago, but this takes place in Antioch. So you think about where this is, if you want some more context and background. I think we hit the kind of high point. From an interpretation standpoint, give me some interpretation of it. What does this mean? Right, but he's kind of flaky. I mean, he's flip flopping again because he's afraid that it's just peer pressure. He is confusing everybody. So I do think there's a meaning there. There's a kind of an interpretive meaning there that one of the reasons that we need to that accountability is important. One of the reasons that maybe we need to confront people from time to time is that not only are they leading themselves astray, verse 11, Peter stands condemned, right? And that's what Paul says, and we can talk about what condemnation means there. So not only in your action are you leading yourself astray, and are you sinning and therefore condemned, but you're leading other people astray. Like Peter's action called, he's a leader, and people are following him. And it's Barnabas, and it's more than, the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him. So we think about, and again, this is what I was kind of talking about a little bit ago when I said, sometimes we're maybe too passive. And sometimes we're like, I don't feel like answering a fool, I'm content to let the foolish person continue to live like a fool. But the problem with that is not just that the foolish person is going to continue to live like a fool, but maybe some of his friends are going to continue to live. You know what I mean? You end up potentially dragging other people with you. And that's what's going on here, and that's a huge deal.
And then if you tell yourself this, then you're
Right.
so it's easier to do this than to back and forth.
Sure. And again, we have to be careful, like with the application, like how far we push this in our lives. Like, there's wisdom in all of that too. But I know when we talk about that passage from Proverbs 26, there's almost if we don't address it sometimes, it's almost like we're enabling it, we're going along with it, and we're that seems okay. Like you in your inaction, you're almost supportive, or it can be perceived that way. And I think that's one of the reasons why Paul's just like, yeah, Peter came to Antioch, I probably can do his face, because we're done with it. We're not. This isn't going to continue.
And it goes back to the context of who he's talking about. He's not talking about nobody. He's
Right.
talking about
Yeah, and we can go there, and certainly the Bible says that. Leaders there's a high level of accountability. It's not an excuse for anybody else not to do something, but that's just what the Bible says. And note that, to that point, Paul goes after Peter. He didn't go to Barnabas, because he recognizes that the problem really is Peter. And Barnabas is wrong for following Peter. I'm not saying that, he doesn't bear any responsibility here, but Paul goes straight to the ringleader on some level and points the finger at him. You're the problem. This is where it starts. What else from an interpretation aspect? What does this mean? Interact with, we brought up in the observations, interact with this whole fear thing, this whole fear pressure. What's the teaching there? What does that mean? Yeah, right? I mean, yeah. But that's exactly what happens here. You know, Peter was fine until the certain men from James, the circumcision party, you know, the cool kids from Jerusalem came in, and all of a sudden he's like, you know, well, I don't want to look uncool in their eyes, and so peer pressure, fear, whatever we don't call it, like.
Truth is freedom.
Well, but that's the problem. Like there's a disconnect. Peter knew the truth, and that's why I started. You know, the context of this. You got to read Acts 10, a little bit of 11, and Acts chapter 15. Peter knows the truth. Like he has a vision from heaven, and God's like speaking to him, saying, "No, this is okay. You can eat with Gentiles." That's the whole reason. You know, he sent to Cornelius' house, and in Acts chapter 10 it says he spent several days at Cornelius' house. Well, Cornelius is a Roman, he's a Gentile, and for a good Jew, like, dude, I don't go to your house. If I'm a Jew and you're a Gentile at that time, I ain't going to your house. You know, we're not watching the Super Bowl together because you guys are other. And yet we know from Acts chapter 10, like, Peter goes, and so it's like, yeah, he knows the truth, but there's this disconnect there on this level.
Oh, somebody do that. And she looked at that and she said, don't ever, it's just right in my eyes, don't ever think that you're above any sin. But it stuck with me, and it was so true, and it turned out that she came and talked to me, you know, maybe a week, maybe a month later, and said, I just started fasting, and I knew when you said it, I was giving it to you. And so, you know, I think we have to be careful now, in this case, the text is talking about humility, that we humble, we are not above any sin. If we allow ourselves to just have it, it could happen to us too. And that's what happens to Peter.
Okay. One of the passages, I'm not sure which number it was on that list, but that was the question. Ask questions. Right? The wise man, the man of understanding, asks questions and draws out the deep water. So I want to push this a little bit. What's the deep water here? Like what's really the problem that Paul is getting at? Like why is Paul so forceful in immediately confronting Peter? Yes, but I make the argument that hypocrisy, that's the surface issue. What's the real problem? Like that, with that? Okay, the truth of the gospel, right? What's the truth of the gospel that Peter is violating? And so this is why I kind of talk about these questions, and sometimes maybe we have to ask questions and push a little bit to really bring out that understanding that what's going on behind the scenes in when we talk about the angry guy, like what is motivating him, you know, his insecurity or whatever. What's the, from a gospel standpoint, what's the problem? Okay, he's definitely not making disciples because he's leading them the wrong way. Yeah, it's sin, but
Struggling to find confidence in the gospel and his identity
as Peter goes along with this circumcision party group, when he draws back from the Gentile believers, what he is doing, whether it's explicit or implicit, is he is saying that the gospel is not enough. Okay, and you hit it when you said, you know, he's not in step with the truth of the gospel. The truth of the gospel says that I am saved because of what Jesus did on the cross, and I am justified. That is, I have been declared righteous in God's eyes, not because of what I did, but because of what Jesus did. There is no there's no level of holiness, there's no level of acceptance before God that is any better than what the righteousness that Jesus did. Because that's justification, being declared righteous. And by his actions, what Peter is saying is that the gospel is not enough. That if you want to be a real Christian, if you want to be a holy Christian, if you want to be, kind of this upper level of Jesus followers, then you have to follow all of these other rules. And you don't hang out with Gentiles, and you probably don't take them anymore. You see, he's adding things to the gospel. And I think that's why Paul just so hard just hits him on this justification. The background, of course, to that is the book of Galatians in general is centered around this idea of justification. Galatians chapter 3, verse 11. The just will live by faith. And that is one of the themes of the entire book. And I really think that's why Paul hits this so hard. Because he realizes that Peter is, by his actions, probably not intentional. I don't think Peter thought through this enough to be like, wow, if I do this, I'm adding something to the gospel that's not actually there. But that's the reality. It's kind of the deep water in this situation that's coming out of Peter's actions. And again, this isn't just about him, he's leading other people astray, and probably turning some of these Gentiles off. All of a sudden it's like, well, you can eat with me, and so these people stood up, and now you're not eating with me. It's like, and that's going to leave a bad taste in the Gentiles, in Gentile communities. They're not going to actually appreciate it. But again, I think that's the deep water, if you will, of the real kind of heart issue that's going on. And so I think if you think about accountability coming alongside confrontation, you need to kind of work towards that. Whether that's questions, whether that's wisdom, whether that's using and applying God's word and kind of looking at things through the lens of the gospel. Like what's the real issue? What's the heart issue? Maybe this guy's angry because he's insecure. Maybe this guy's never been faithful to his wife, again, because he's insecure and his identity is wrapped up in whatever. You play that out, whatever the situation is. But we need to be kind of looking at, again, at the deep water.
Well, that statement then, is that then, is that in reference that his work, when the Bible says no man testify of the work of God? So in a sense, because the way he was living, saying, was sort of saying I'm justified by the works of God, in a sense. I mean, I know that he was speaking the gospel, but his actions were saying, well, I got to live this way. I don't know why. I'm trying to
Yeah,
I'm trying to understand what I'm at. Could be done. Does that mean could be voluntary? Is that what it means? I'm a little confused about that.
I read that as that he was caught in the act. I think he's guilty of sin. I read that, and I can look it up further, but just initially, I would read that as that he was sin, not condemned in that he's losing or he's lost his salvation and he's turning again. But again, I think what Paul is saying is that I oppose him because he is sin. He is living in sin. This area as well, he is living in sin. And again, he's sinning ultimately because he's betraying the truth of the
So, you know how sometimes like these census issues that we see, you try to approach someone and say, there is this that I see, and they get all like
Yeah,
Concern is an issue might not actually be that horrible, but why they're choosing to act in this way is the act horrible. And so,
and yeah, I agree with that. You hear me when I say this. This is like everything else. Like, you can take this too far. Like, we can play this, hey, I'm Sigmund Freud, I'm going to psychoanalyze you, and, you know, because you're in the oral retentive stage and all these concepts. Like we can push this too far. Like, you can always look for, you know, the 90% of the iceberg that's underwater, and it may be that this is really just an ice cube, and what you see is what you get. Okay, so don't be like, I'm just going to badger Reed until he tells me what the real problem is. You know, there's some wisdom, some tact that needs to go along with it. But I do think, you know, when we talk about anger, think of somebody that habitually lies. Like why do you lie? Like, why do you really lie? Okay, you're guilty of something, but yeah, there's a shame. You're afraid of the truth. You know, and at some point, on a spiritual level, I think you can make the argument that somewhere there's a lack of faith. Like either I'm guilty, I know I'm guilty, and whatever. But that lack of trust that, wow, if I tell the truth, you know, God will actually take care of it. So just be careful of that. I mean, you know, it's easy to look at this case and be like, yeah, you know, well, that's the real issue. It's harder, you know, like when Reed and I are having this conversation. Right. Be careful, you know. It's not helpful for me to, yeah, I probably shouldn't go to Jay and be like, what do you think it is? You know, and Jay's the bookie here, right? And we're posting odds about what the real issue is. That's not
it comes
really.
back to asking good questions, so
It
in
does.
their
It does.
relationship with you, you should know if they're
Right. No, I mean, I think Reed's okay.
How big is your iceberg?
Yeah. But I think the key word you said already is act. That's the key word you said already. I mean, you do that in all aspects of that, you're going down the right road. That's it.
Okay, application. So what do you do with this? What's the lesson here?
When you're wrong, don't do what you're wrong do. You know what? Yeah. And when you're wrong, do what you're wrong.
Yeah, that's a little
Change it, just spin it.
Just a, yeah, right. Twist it a little bit. What's the application? Okay. Yeah, well, stick with the gospel, certainly. Yeah, I like sticking with the gospel. Unless being willing, be willing to lovingly confront. That wisdom. Yeah, especially if you're a parent. You know, you have two people that are always watching you.
But as a Christian, even more so, like someone I heard about him on a blog, there's always someone watching God, but but trying to know each other example.
Isaiah doesn't eat dog food because I do.
It's not as anyway.
Must have been.
Yeah, I guess those are a couple that stick out in my mind, like the whole And then the personal side, again, and then it's every week, like, if you're gonna have to wrestle individually, is what the personal piece is. And maybe that's the situation in your own life, you know, the best applications that we need to say about it not to instead of pretending like you don't see it.
And don't say it, and there's something about a person that's that for a moment,
Sure, sure.
super awesome.
Do that. Okay, for the record, we got 3 minutes early. I don't know if it'll take 3 minutes, but we will pray and close. That's good. God, as always, we are just blessed by your word and the privilege that we have to come together and to study it and talk and to laugh and to share and to just kind of wrestle with it. God, I pray that your word would convict us, and that even as a group, that you would use us to sharpen each other, that we would be the people that you have called us and created us. God, obviously, we just look to you. Pray that you would lead us and even bless us this evening as we go to our home. We love you.